Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. 4 after 8 o'clock. News and views on Salam Media. Welcome. My name is Julie Ali, and we are joined by Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Assalamu alaikum, Ashraf. Welcome to the program.
Walaikum salam, Julie and listeners. Hope you're all well.
Alhamdulillah. This must be an exceptionally busy time for you guys. Trying to make sense and analyzing all of the discussions being held at the BRICS Summit, and very especially to try and get to the heart of the matter, because there's a lot of double speak that goes on at these summits, is there not?
Yes, Julie, it's a fascinating time for international relations and development practitioners. These events happen once a year, but such events like the BRICS expansion are milestone events that many decades from now, citizens and historians would look back and say, look, South Africa 2023 was a very important milestone for a new kind of economic order that has taken root. So yes, it's fascinating times, and definitely remember political leaders at the highest level definitely have to make very particular statements, postures, and as well as perspectives that is in line with where the nations are at any given point in time, what the challenges are, as well as the BRICS bloc and where it's carving a very significant role in world affairs. So absolutely fascinating time.
And you're absolutely spot on, because China's Xi Jinping said in remarks delivered at the BRICS Business Forum, and I quote, "Right now, changes in the world, in our times and in history, are unfolding in ways like never before, bringing human society to a critical juncture. The course of history will be shaped by the choices we make." Unquote. So it's exactly what you're saying, isn't it?
And remember, President Xi is what is called a significant leader in Chinese history. So, throughout the Chinese, the new China post World War II, in its 75 years, it had several leaders, such as Chairman Mao. Then the other significant leader was Chairman Deng Xiaoping, that opened China to the world. And now, a generation later, you have President Xi, who has his own philosophy and perspective on world affairs, on the Confucius values, and how China engages with the world as a significant power. So when he makes a statement, a political speech, it's highly significant. And as you can see, the diplomatic investment and the teams that have come from all BRICS nations, but especially China, seeks to send a signal to Africa and as well as the world that the developing South and Africa is a key priority and won't get left behind in this new folding world economic order.
Very important statements were made. And of course, these world leaders, or some of these world leaders that are attending the BRICS Summit, believe that their role is to plot the future course of the bloc of developing nations, but divisions obviously re-emerge ahead of critical debates over potential expansion of the group, and the intention is to boost its global clout. We do know that developing nations were always at the behest of Western nations, particularly the colonizers and, of course, the US. Is this going to be the turning point? Is this BRICS Summit the start of something new, a new emergence?
Now, given the momentum, look, we must look at it in perspective. The turning point has been the COVID crisis and the post-COVID world order, as well as the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So in the last 3 years, these two significant events have driven the large powers in a very specific kind of engagement with each other and the world. And on the one hand, the West has consolidated around its own economic and political order vis-a-vis NATO. And then you have the East that's also consolidating. And then you have the global South. So China is part of both. It's now one can call it a developed economy because it's the second largest economy in the world, but it's also part of the global South and a leader of the global South, being part of BRICS and the G77 and the G20, etc. So all these BRICS nations participate in these forums, and yes, some have very close relations with the West as political allies or sub-allies, and others have very competitive relationships in a very complicated manner through value chains, through trade, through investment, through technology. So it is now what is called decisively a multipolar order. So you will hear BRICS leaders and President Xi in particular refer to the multipolar order and no more the unipolar order. And I think this is a significant break post-Cold War. So we have entered, at least economically, into a multipolar world order.
Okay, South African organizers of the BRICS Summit have said that there will be no discussions of a common BRICS currency. This was an idea obviously floated by Brazil as an alternative to dollar dependence. But this is, despite what the organizers have said, we know that this is on everybody's minds. The whole story around de-dollarization. I'm wondering if the US will retaliate in any way regarding this concept. And I'm also wondering, Trump is in the running once again, for the forthcoming American elections, and he wants to run once again for presidency. But he was totally, let's just assume that he does win the elections. He's got no interest in Africa at all. Does that then matter that BRICS then develops a new currency? We also know that the idea of developing this currency is going to take quite some time, but bearing in mind that it's going to impact on the dollar at some point, whether it's in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, they're probably going to do they're going to probably try to mitigate the negative impacts on their economy.
Yes, it's important to note that huge discussions like the currency are what is called process-orientated. So if you recall, discussions on the New Development Bank began in 2010, and the New Development Bank mechanisms were started in 2010, 2011, and finally the institution was formed in 2015, 3 or 4 years later. So likewise, the BRICS currency processes are beginning to take shape. And the first phase, I understand, would be bilateral trade within BRICS nations and between BRICS and the expanded partnerships. So Argentina could trade with Brazil in different currencies, regional currencies. So it will start with nation states, and then it will move to the regional level. Already Brazil and China have started their initiative because they're huge traders in commodities, for instance. So it would start at a commodity level, and that would cushion the volatility of the dollar because the dollar is volatile. And trading in dollar is expensive, the cost structures, etc., etc. So this model is more fit for purpose model for developing countries. And therefore, the currency is not the be-all and end-all of the summit. It's one of many areas of discussion. Remember, the BRICS has many working groups. So we have working groups on finance, on trade and investment, on digital technologies, on agriculture, and especially climate change. I would imagine the real debate is also around climate change and the green, they call it green industrialization, which is quite different from the just energy transition. So there's interesting dynamics within BRICS and very good models that are attractive for the global south, for Africa and other nations in the world. So yes, the currency discussion is a big one. It will happen as the new development bank process has happened, and it will gain momentum. And as the situation changes and more members join, it will gain a broader pool. And through economies of scale, that's how it grows. But it starts at the bilateral level. So yes, it's interesting times.
Okay, Ashraf, we need to go for an ad break, but when we come back, I want you to unpack a little more regarding the new development bank. Where are we, currently regarding the bank? How does that tie in with a possible BRICS currency? Bearing in mind that, this whole story, the de-dollarization, and everything that's going to be discussed at BRICS, the underpinning issue all has to do with this currency issue, because it impacts on everything and everybody, not only at the macro level, but also the micro level. We'll get back to that after the break. And then also I'd like you to unpack the green industrialization concept, if you possibly can, right after the ad break. So much to cover in the limited time that I have with you this morning, but let's try and see what we can get through. Please stay with us.
No problem.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Spread warmth this winter with Africa Muslims Agency's Winter Warmth campaign. Sayyidina Umar Al-Khattab radiallahu anhu would advise his companions, winter, which is an enemy, has come, so prepare for it with wool, leather socks and socks. Let us help the thousands of South Africans without adequate clothing or shelter to prepare for the harsh winter months by providing them with blankets for 150 Rand and winter warmth packs for 300 Rand. Spread warmth with Africa Muslims Agency. Call AMA on 011-834-8685 or donate online at africamuslimsagency.co.za. Africa Muslims Agency. Empowering, educating, inspiring.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness, and every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and free zakat calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031-208-9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
As the chilly winds sweep across our beautiful land, Let us remember those in need. In South Africa, recent weather conditions have left many vulnerable individuals and families struggling to stay warm and nourished. With Ashraful Aid, you can donate a loaf of bread for 10 Rand, a blanket for 150 Rand, or soup for 100 people for just 230 Rand. Donate today at www.ashrafulaid.org. Winter warmth, it starts with you.
There's no smell that takes me back to the comfort of my childhood than the smell of black seed oil being applied by my nanny. Now I'm using Tib black seed in my own home to soothe sniffles and coughs, to help with digestion and immunity, and of course, as part of my beauty routine. After all these years, I've come to appreciate the wisdom in finding comfort and shifa in trusted treatments like Tib black seed. You can find Tib black seed at all leading pharmacies or find out more at blackseed.co.za.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
The BRICS Summit has kicked off yesterday. Lots of hype and excitement at the Sandton Convention Centre, and people like Ashraf Patel, who is the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and other political analysts are hard at work dissecting and analysing all the issues that are being put on the table at the BRICS Summit by the nations that are involved. And of course, really interesting times. And I guess this is not where it ends. It ends tomorrow, but the work continues. I suppose the work really starts when the all the leaders leave South Africa, and all the hard work then starts. And that also means for people like Ashraf Patel and other analysts, they continue analyzing progress and commitments that were made or is made during the BRICS Summit and the way ahead. Ashraf, welcome back. I would be correct in suggesting that, wouldn't I, that the work really begins once the summit is over. Ashraf, are you there? Ashraf, I can't hear you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Ashraf
I can.
Patel?
Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear
Hello?
you now. Yes, I can hear you now.
Thank you.
Did you hear my opening remarks?
Yes. So
Okay.
basically, the work starts today. It's a very detailed program, both today and tomorrow, with many sessions on all the big themes of the day. So you are correct. The work will commence once leadership leaves. It devolves to the ministries, the state-owned enterprises, the BRICS Business Council, etc., etc. But it also will involve a whole of society approach, because it's important. The people-to-people exchanges are very important, whether it's trade among small business people, whether it's small-scale agriculture, etc., etc. And I think very important, South Africa is taking on board the African continent in these engagements. So it's a huge effort. It's not just a South African show. We've got 32 African leaders, and that's quite significant.
Ashraf, the new development bank, a question I posed to you before the ad break, and the possibility of a BRICS currency, how will that tie in?
Yes, so generally, I was comparing the process of setting up the BRICS currency with that of the New Development Bank. So the New Development Bank has been operational for the last 7 years.
Right.
It was conceptualized 10 years ago. And likewise, the BRICS currency is a new initiative. And the processes that will lead up to a formal currency should take a few years. But the small trade or trade between nations or regional trade currencies, that is the new innovation. And that would be the foundation of a new financial architecture within the BRICS community. And I think that is significant, that these are processes. They will start. You'll get technical working groups, you'll get regulatory working groups, etc., etc. And there is a huge push purely because of the multiple challenges in the world. And remember, there's a huge debt crisis many in the global south are facing, especially sub-Saharan Africa. There's 7 or 8 nations that are about to default in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's the issue of a more affordable financial model becomes a matter of survival. Many of these nations don't have fiscal sustainability. They cannot balance their budgets. And they go into what is called IMF-style riots when citizens rise because of the high cost of living. Yes, it's linked also to the global conflicts in the value chains in commodities. But primarily it's financial policy, austerity. And therefore, BRICS nations are at the cutting edge of more inclusive economic models that can cushion the harsh realities of, let's say, the neoliberal order. So yes, there's a lot to discuss.
Regarding debt crisis in developing countries or the developing world, I've often wondered what happens in a situation like that. Say, for example, China, Russia, or even the Western world, be it the States or one of the European countries, realize that there's an issue of famine or conflict, and that creates economic hardships for the entire country. They then donate, or they then commit to X amount, either in financial aid, hard financial aid, or in terms of food, etc., grain, and a whole host of other aid packages that they send through. Is that aid, is it non-refundable, or is it some sort of an agreement that the two countries go into? Let's assume the state says that we'll bail you out by assisting with a couple of $1 million or $1 billion to get you over this hurdle, to get your economy going, to start growing food, to feed the nation, and really create employment. The developing country then takes the money. They start off, but let's assume they failed somewhere along the line, or the plan didn't work out as they had intended, because other issues then came into play. Let's assume climate issues impacted then, and they're unable to pay back this debt. What happens in a situation like this?
Yes, remember the debt crisis was at its peak in the 80s and 90s, of which African nations like Zambia and others were the case studies of the very worst of the World Bank and IMF models. And in the 90s, there was a huge reform process called the HIPIC Initiative, Highly Indebted Nations Program, of which most of these debts were written off. But even at that stage, in the late 90s, when you write off debt, the IMF and particularly the creditor nations would impose very specific kind of economic policies that these nation states would have to adopt. And those are called conditionalities. And that also South Africa had to adopt, as we had to write off the apartheid debts. So the new government also had to adopt conditionalities. And that's the model. That has been the model for the last 3 decades. And that means that you got to privatize state-owned enterprises. You got to deregulate. You got to open up your markets for global corporations to participate. So everything South Africa has done in the last 20 years is a good model of that kind of conditionalities. And I think it's happening now with Eskom and Transnet in particular. It's not that they want to privatize overnight or break up Eskom into 3 parts and sell off our harbors, which we've just done last week. We've sold the Durban harbor to a Philippine corporation, for instance. These are conditionalities. And remember, during the COVID crisis, pandemic, South Africa took an IMF bailout. It was 500 billion rand equivalent. And that was not free. So we assumed that the IMF has given us a
Exactly,
COVID
exactly.
bailout.
And exactly, I wonder how then do we pay off that debt if we don't have the money to do so?
Absolutely. So if we don't have the money, then the next best thing is we got to open up ESCOM and
Ah,
Transnet and SAA to international investors. And that's exactly what's happened. So when the minister says we're going to privatize, he's not speaking as a minister that has sovereignty. It's just that we decided to take the IMF loan that has not been made public as yet, and all the detail is in the conditionalities. And therefore, when Treasury talks about municipalities having to ensure that utilities, private sector can participate in the utility and distribution, everything from prepaid meters to private-public partnerships are examples of IMF conditionality. So everything you see is in terms of this new model of deregulation is part of those IMF conditionalities. So that's a good example. But it's worse in sub-Saharan Africa. If you go to Ghana, Zambia, Kenya, these were so-called rising stars of Africa about 15 years ago. They were commodity producers. They were mining powerhouses. They made a lot of money, and middle class grew. What's happening now is they're going into debt. Ghana cannot pay off its debts. So it had to go for another $3 billion IMF loan in February. The same with Zambia. And so these are the kind of big issues that the G20 will discuss next month when it meets in India, the debt rescheduling
okay.
of
So
the.
this won't get discussed at BRICS at all.
Well, BRICS will have a position, yes. They will formulate a position and put it on the table, but whether they would do it as a BRICS bloc within the G20 or just as part of the general G20 agenda is still too early to tell. I think all the details will be discussed in this week's Head of Summit, and you'll get a BRICS communique on Friday. And it would be good to read the communique in detail because it goes into a high level of detail on what the discussions were on the key points.
That's why I love talking with you, Ashraf Patel. I can throw anything at you, and you are such a deep thinker and you know your stuff. So, real pleasure having you on the show. Let's go to the points of contention as far as the summit is concerned. We do know that India and China have periodically clashed along their disputed border, adding to the challenge of decision making in a group that relies on consensus. How does that, that's the one issue. Earlier on, I brought in the USA and de-dollarization, which you've responded to, but we also understand that Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, said that he does not see BRICS as a turning point into a geopolitical rival of the United States. He goes on to say this is a very diverse collection of countries with differences of view on critical issues. And I go back to India and China and their borders, their dispute over their borders. This is their stance. Is it just the US once again trying to be Superman as far as world order is concerned? Or are they really concerned? So let's look at those two issues. Can you please respond to them?
Indeed, BRICS nations are diverse. Even the core five have very different economic, ideological, and governance systems in the way they see the world. So yes, India and China are the giants of the developing South. Both were founding members of the non-aligned movement in the 50s. There was that conflict and war in 62, which was unfortunate. And there's a history to it, and I don't know the detail, but yes, it has been a scar on their relations for many, many decades. And as a result, and remember, Pakistan also being a player because of the partition, and naturally Pakistan then developed this relations with China, and then India looked towards the Soviet Union. So there are very strong historical rivalries there. At least BRICS brings in these parties under one bloc, and it's an important bloc, and it's important for India to stay in BRICS, primarily because of the Global South agenda. So to stick with the development, trade, economic agenda, that's vital for all their citizens and their regions and the Global South. So if there are conflicts, it can be managed within the BRICS forums, and it doesn't become bilateral conflicts, which would escalate. But I don't see it as, I think things are sorting out. There is strategic rivalry, absolutely. China is the new superpower. The question being, is there a new Cold War between the US and China? And even the European Union has taken a strategic autonomy position. Now, that's very important. The EU doesn't see itself necessarily siding with the US vis-a-vis China. The EU, many senior delegations have gone to China because they see huge trade and investment opportunities. And they also, as the EU, taking a strategic position in world affairs, fairly semi-independent from the US. So it's not necessarily that the West is a hegemonic bloc. And China is significant purely because it has mastered the globalization game. It's got $3 trillion in surplus. It's investing in all these development projects and infrastructure projects. So it has leverage globally. And therefore, you saw President Ramaphosa beaming and hosted the China-South Africa summit yesterday, before the BRICS Summit, only because he knows that's where the money is. And really, none of the other BRICS partners will put such money on the table. But there has to be this broader partnerships. And I think China is serious about Africa. You see the resources they put it down. And I think it's a different model from the World Bank, IMF, the Western model. But it's also about trade, back to business. It's not, remember, it's not charity. And so it's very important for us to understand in sub-Saharan Africa, these are not necessarily charitable. The Chinese model is very business-like. They work within very particular frameworks, especially of governance. And yes, they are more generous in terms of the terms of trade, in terms of better models of helping you develop your own enterprises. But when you conduct trade, it's within a market framework. So it's not within a communist or socialist framework. It's within a social market framework. It means the trade and the prices of goods and services are all market related. And the logic of the market, this is an interesting model. And therefore, entrepreneurship is very important. And therefore, if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking at opportunities in BRICS, this is the time. If you want to export, China is going to open up the market, India to a lesser extent, Brazil. So yes, start with trade, because in trade is where wealth is created to trade. And we see in China today, they didn't become a superpower on state-owned enterprises only. They became a superpower because they opened up the market for entrepreneurs to run and to really develop. They gave very generous support and subsidies to the entrepreneurs to scale. And once they scale, they go global. And today you've seen the result. So we need to develop that entrepreneurship mindset, but with a social conscious.
Okay, and what about the comments by Jake Sullivan of the US talking about BRICS turning into a geopolitical rival, or it doesn't see BRICS as a geopolitical rival of the United States? Is not the intention of the BRICS, or is it?
Yes, he's partially correct. I think he's generally correct. It is a correct statement in assessment, because BRICS itself does not see itself as an anti-Western bloc. but it does see itself as being very confident and robust in making very clear requests and demands of the global system, and really taking forward the unfinished business of decolonization that started with the Bandung Conference in '55 under the non-aligned movement. A lot of the work of the United Nations around sustainable development, around reforms, around, especially at the World Trade Organization, that needs a lot of reforms on a better trade deal. And as Africa, especially, trade is a lifeline. If we cannot get a fair trade deal with the EU or the US on the basics, on agriculture, on trade, on tariffs, we're not going to develop our industries. And the UN has what is called the right to development, and that's a UN agenda. So it's not just about moving towards, let's say, the just energy transition overnight. Yes, there is the UN, for instance, climate change treaties, COP27, but there's also the UN right to development, which balances it out, and it gives developing countries the right to develop along their own pathways. So these are very complicated discussions. And if you're a small country like Niger or Guinea-Bissau or Lesotho, Swaziland, you cannot enter the world system on your own. You need help. And I think nations like BRICS, the models and the support and the technology that they can provide is the big benefit, so that these poorer nations can have a better deal at the local level, at the regional level. And when they go global, you've got the BRICS bloc on your side as such, where you're not on your own. Because if you look at the model of, let's say, the economic partnership agreements between the EU and different African states, all those states have signed different agreements, individual agreements with the EU, and the power relations were unequal, and so they lost out. And today we see the result. So BRICS as a bloc, that's why it's called a bloc. You're a bloc where you can negotiate and get a better deal if you work together. And that is the operating logic of the BRICS architecture.
And that's where we leave it. Ashraf, thank you indeed for indulging us this long regarding the BRICS Summit, but it is a very, very important summit, lest we think it's just a whole host of world leaders or couple of leaders from developing countries getting together and just being talking heads. It's way, way bigger than that, and it impacts on each and every one of our lives and our countries going forward. Undoubtedly, we'll still be talking more in the future, but thank you indeed for your time and your deep insights into these issues. Keep well, and assalamu alaikum to you.
Shukran. Walaikum salam.
That was Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Standing by at 8:42 a.m., we are going to be talking with Abdul Alim Hamza, Head of Fund Development at Islamic Relief South Africa.
Rejuvenating